This was never meant to be known by anyone. The receipt was a ghost, a thin, brittle brown piece of paper that was stuck inside the binding of a tax ledger from 1849. For more than 170 years, dust and institutional silence kept it a secret. Now, though, it's out in the open. On April 11th, in the humid, mosquito-filled air of Augustine Parish, Louisiana, a deal was made that was meant to be forgotten. A young man, not even 19, was sold on the steps of the courthouse. There was never any official record of his crime. It cost 17 cents. Maeve O'Connell, a widow, bought him. She had just moved to the country and lost her husband to the fever a year ago. She needed help with her small, failing plot of land. She only saw a boy, a deal that came about because of some bad luck she couldn't understand. She gave him the 17 copper pennies, signed the deed with a shaky X, and then took him away. She never really knew that his name wasn't Kalin. She never knew that the crime he was accused of was a lie, a carefully planned piece of theater. And she never, ever knew that he had been secretly married to someone else just 3 months earlier. How does a story like this just disappear from history? What were we never supposed to find out? Not only was the truth hidden in an archive, but a man with the power to make reality bend to his will erased it from the world. He didn't just want to hurt the boy, he wanted him to die. He wanted him to be a footnote on a 17-cent receipt, a life worth less than a handful of nails. The silence that came after wasn't an accident. It was planned. Judge Alistair Finch was the one who put together this scary play about people. In Augustine Parish, his word was more than just law. It was the Bible. He was a man made of granite and swamp shadow, and for 3 generations his family had been in charge of the parish's legal and financial matters. He had complete power, not because he owned thousands of acres of land, but because he could decide what was true. He was in charge of the court, chose the sheriff, and had the mortgages on half of the businesses in town. If you crossed Judge Finch, you weren't just risking your job, you were risking your life. He could take a man's name off the voting rolls, make his credit disappear, and take his property because of a technicality that no one else knew about. He was a king in every way but name, and his kingdom was a place of stifling order where everyone knew their place. Kalin, the boy, had been one of his purchases. He wasn't born on his plantation. He was bought from a trader who was passing through from Virginia years before. He was quiet, very smart, and had a stillness about him that made the other slaves uneasy and the judge interested. Finch didn't see him as a person. He saw him as a beautiful, complicated chess piece. He secretly taught Kalin how to read, understand ledgers, and even speak a little French. It was a whim, something I wanted to do. The judge liked having something that no one else had, a mind he had built up himself and a soul he thought he had written. But once a mind is open, it's hard to control. Kalin saw the world in a way that the judge never expected. This clarity would lead him to the one person in Augustine Parish he was never, ever supposed to see as an equal. A whispered historical rumor from that time, passed down through the Gullah communities along the coast, talks about shadow marriages, which were unions between the enslaved and the powerful that were not legal but were based on older, more binding vows. They were secrets that, if revealed, could unravel the very fabric of that society. This story is one of them. Kalin's duties eventually brought him inside the judge's immaculate white-pillared mansion. He was put in charge of the library, a huge quiet room full of books from London and Paris. It was there that he met Genevieve Finch, the judge's only daughter. She was 17, a ghost in her own home, educated but isolated, surrounded by wealth but suffocating from the rigid expectations of her father. She was promised to a senator's son from Baton Rouge, a political alliance that would further cement the Finch dynasty. Genevieve, however, had a mind as sharp as her father's, and a heart he had long since forgotten how to nurture. She saw in Kaelin not a servant, not a piece of property, but the only other person in her world who seemed to be truly alive. They started talking in whispers, behind the leather-bound spines of Voltaire and Shakespeare. He talked about the stars, and she talked about the ocean. He taught her the names of the constellations as he understood them from African folklore. She read him poetry from books her father forbade her to open. They were two prisoners in the same gilded cage, and in that shared confinement, something forbidden and beautiful began to grow. It was a love that was impossible, a love that was a death sentence, and they both knew it. But knowing and stopping were two different things. Their stolen moments became more frequent, more desperate. The silence of the library charged with a meaning that would soon tear their world apart. It was more than a romance. It was a rebellion of the soul. In the dead of winter, under the skeletal branches of a live oak that had stood for 300 years, they made a vow. They knew no priest would marry them, that no law would recognize their union. So they found an old woman on the edge of the swamp, a root doctor named Elizabeth, who practiced traditions that predated the parish, that predated America itself. In a ceremony lit by a single candle, with vows spoken in a mixture of English and a language the judge would have called pagan nonsense, they bound themselves to each other. For a few stolen weeks, they were husband and wife in a kingdom of two, their secret a fragile shield against the world. But secrets in a place like Augustine Parish have a way of bleeding through. A misplaced book, a lingering look held a second too long, a note discovered by a house servant loyal to the judge. The details of how Finch found out are lost, but the explosion of his rage was legendary. It was not the hot, screaming rage of a common man. It was a cold fury, a terrifying, silent pressure that seemed to suck the very air out of a room. He didn't confront them. He didn't rage or accuse. He simply began to move his pieces. The first move was to isolate Genevieve. She was locked in her room, her books taken away, and the windows of her world got smaller and smaller until all she could see was her father's cold, unyielding face. He never raised his voice. He simply explained in calm, measured tones that she had dishonored her name, her family, and her God. He told her she was sick, that her mind had been poisoned, and that he would cure her. It was a campaign of psychological warfare designed to break her spirit completely. His second move was against Kaelin. The judge understood that simply killing the boy would be too merciful. It would also create a martyr. No, death was an ending. The judge wanted to erase it. He needed to utterly annihilate the man his daughter had chosen, to reduce him to a state so low, so pitiful, that the very memory of him would become a source of shame for Genevieve. He devised a plan of exquisite cruelty. He put a silver locket, which he had given his daughter years ago, in Kaelin's small sleeping area. Then, he had the sheriffa man whose career and life belonged to Finch discover the stolen item. Stealing was a common crime, but stealing from the judge's own family was a crime that could never be forgiven. In the middle of the night, Kaelin was pulled out of bed. Genevieve was never seen by him again. He was put in the parish jail, a damp stone box where he spent 2 weeks without saying a word. He wasn't hit or whipped. The judge's cruelty was more subtle. He was just left alone in the dark with the silence and the rats to think about how powerless he was. The charge was read out loud. Theft of property worth $20. The punishment, according to parish law, was to be sold at a public auction. Everything was fine with the law. It was all a huge lie. The judge himself signed the order, and his handwriting was as beautiful and harsh as he was. He wasn't just killing a man, he was changing a story, rewriting a truth that made him angry, and making sure that the final draft didn't mention his daughter's love. The auction was going to happen on April 11th. The morning was hot and hazy, and it felt like a storm was coming later in the day. There was a small group of people on the courthouse lawn, mostly farmers and small-time merchants. They were men with weathered faces and sharp eyes. They were there for animals, for a stolen cotton gin, and for the everyday business of a parish that was having trouble. Kalen was the last group of the day. They brought him out to the steps and tied his hands in front of him. The judge had made it clear that he had to be clean. He shouldn't have looked like a regular field worker. He should have looked like a house slave, something elegant, something that had fallen from a great height. The auctioneer, a man named Bartholomew who owed Judge Finch a lot of money, started the event. He didn't say anything about Kalen's intelligence, reading ability, or skills. He just said what the charge was and what the punishment was. After that, he made the first offer. "Set the price," he yelled, his voice straining, "at 17 cents. The crowd murmured in confusion. 17 cents. That was rude. It was a joke. A man in his prime who was a slave was worth hundreds, maybe even $1,000, even if he was accused of stealing. This low price could mean one of two things. Either the man was secretly sick and dying, or it was something else entirely. It was a sign. The smarter men in the crowd got it right away. This wasn't a sale. It was a ritual that was set up by an unseen hand to shame people in public. To bid would mean to get involved in the business of the powerful, and no one in Augustine Parish was dumb enough to do that. The silence was thick and uncomfortable. Then, in that moment of deafening silence, Maeve O'Connell, the widow, made her move. She didn't get the politics. She couldn't see the invisible lines of power that were in the air. She only saw a boy who looked lost, and a price she could afford. Her husband had left her with 3 acres of land that had not been plowed and a bill at the general store. She could get help for 17 cents. It was easy, but desperate math. Despite the heat, she pushed her way through the small crowd, pulling her shawl tightly around her shoulders. 17 cents, she said in a thin but clear voice. "I'll take him." Bartholomew, the auctioneer, looked shocked. He looked nervously at the courthouse where he knew Judge Finch was watching from his office window. This wasn't supposed to happen. The plan was for Kalen to stand there until the auction ended, like a piece of trash that no one wanted to touch. He would then be sent to the parish work farm, where no one ever came back healthy. But there had been a bid, a public legal bid. If you don't accept it, you would be breaking the laws that the judge said he would uphold. Bartholomew thought for a moment, and sweat beaded on his forehead. 17 cents from the widow, he yelled, his voice breaking. He looked around, hoping that someone would say something to stop this unexpected problem. But the crowd stayed quiet, their faces showing both pity and fear. They knew something this woman didn't. She wasn't just buying a slave. She was picking up a cursed object, a piece of a story she was never meant to be a part of. "Going once," Bartholomew stammered, his eyes darting back to the window of the courthouse. "Going twice." He stopped for a moment to give the universe one last chance to fix this mistake. Nothing. The cicadas screamed in the trees, which sounded like nerves getting frayed. "Sold!" he finally choked out, slamming his gavel down with a sound that felt both final and very wrong. "To the widow O'Connell for 17 cents. Maeve counted the coins and then dropped them into Bartholomew's sweaty palm, her hand shaking a little. A clerk wrote up the deed of sale, and his hands moved so quickly that it looked like he wanted to get rid of the document as soon as possible. Maeve put her X on the paper. The deal was done. She had just bought a person for the price of a spool of thread. Kalen didn't look at her as she led him away from the courthouse steps. He was staring at the window on the second floor, where he knew the judge was watching. For a brief, painful moment, Their eyes met across the square. That look said 1,000 things without saying a word. The judge's face showed that he had won, as if to say, "See what I have made you." Kaylin's face, on the other hand, showed something else. Not defeat, not hatred, but a look of terrifying, unshakable promise. Maeve didn't see any of it. She was a poor widow who had to make a deal out of desperation. She had no idea that she was now the keeper of a king's ruined treasure, the accidental guardian of a secret that could still destroy Augustine Parish. She was bringing him back to her small, dusty cabin, not knowing that she had just bought a man who was married to the daughter of the most powerful man in the world. The cruelest lies are often told in silence. This quote from the philosopher Robert Louis Stevenson perfectly describes the mood in the Oakenell cabin in the days that followed. Maeve didn't know how to deal with Kaylin. He wasn't being rude. He just wasn't there. He worked from dawn to dusk, clearing the hard, clay-packed soil. He moved quickly and without stopping. He did everything she told him to do, and the fact that he did it so perfectly was scary. But he never said anything unless someone else did, and his eyes had a haunted, faraway look, as if he were looking at a world that only he could see. Maeve tried to have a conversation with him. She asked him about his life before, and he said, "I was in service, ma'am." When she asked if he had a family, he just shook his head. The cabin was quieter than the outside air, which was humid. It was a quiet time full of his unspoken past and her unanswered questions. She was a simple, religious, and kind woman. She had always thought of slavery as something that happened on the big plantations far away from her small life. It was now sitting at her rough-hewn table, a living, breathing puzzle. She found herself watching him, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. His hands were rough from working on the farm, but they weren't the hands of a field worker. They were thin and long. Even though he was wearing old clothes, he moved with a grace that seemed out of place. One night, she saw him looking up at the stars with his lips moving, but no sound coming out. He wasn't saying prayers. He was giving the stars names. At the same time, the judge was filled with a quiet, growing anger. The widow's meddling had ruined the perfect balance of his revenge. Kaylin was supposed to fade away into the anonymity of the parish work farm, a place where time moved slowly and people forgot about him. Instead, he lived only 2 miles away, always reminding him of how his daughter had betrayed him. The judge's power was insulted every day that Kaylin lived. He got really into it. He had the sheriff ride by the O'Connell house twice a day, which was a silent way of scaring them. He put pressure on the owner of the general store to refuse Maeve credit, hoping to starve her out and make her sell the boy. But Maeve was strong, and the small group of poor farmers who didn't like the judge started to help her in small ways, like leaving a bag of flour on her porch or a few jars of preserves. They thought it was a quiet way to stand up to the man who had them all under his control. The judge was getting more and more angry. He needed Kaylin to leave, but he couldn't let it happen in a way that would point back to him. There couldn't be another public show. It had to be quiet and over. He started looking for a tool, a person who could work in the dark and solve a problem without leaving any evidence. He found a man like this in Roach, a Cajun tracker who lived deep in the swamps and was said to have skills that weren't completely natural. Roach was a man who could find people who didn't want to be found and make them disappear for good if the price was right. The way things worked on the farm started to change in small ways. Kaylin began to show bits of his true self when he realized that the judge was still looking at him. It was a risky move, but he needed help, and this simple widow was the only one he had. One night he saw her having trouble with her late husband's account book. She could read numbers but not words. He stepped forward without making a sound. "May I, ma'am?" he said in a soft voice. He took the ledger and quickly put the messy entries in order. His handwriting was smooth and beautiful. Maeve looked at the page, then at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked in a low voice. "The judge valued certain skills," he said, and it was the first time she had ever heard him say something ironic. He started to help her in other ways, like showing her how to fix tools she thought were broken and how to water the fields better. He wasn't just a worker, he was a survival architect. They began to form a bond that was weak and unspoken. It wasn't friendship yet. It was the tired respect of two people holding on to the same piece of driftwood in a huge, dangerous ocean. Maeve stopped thinking of him as just a guy with 17 cents worth of muscle and started to see him as a man with deep and mysterious depth. And with that thought came a terrifying thought. Whatever he had done to make Judge Finch angry must have been something very bad. She was hiding not only a runaway, but also a secret. She began to realize that secrets in Augustin Parish cost a lot of money. An old parish diary gave a scary description of the judge's man Roche. "Saw him in town today. He doesn't walk like other men. He glides, silent as a water moccasin. His eyes are the color of swamp mud, and they see everything you try to hide." This was the man who started to circle Maeve's small farm. Before Kaylin saw him, he could feel him there. There was a change in the air, and the woods were still in a way that felt wrong. The birds would stop singing, and the bugs would stop chirping. It was the quiet, deadly silence of a hunter getting closer to his prey. Kaylin understood what it meant. The judge was getting impatient. Time was running out. He had to do something. He had one last card up his sleeve, a secret he had kept from Genevieve. He had been able to hide the only proof of his marriage before they took him. Not a piece of paper that could be burned, but something that would last much longer. He had a small book of poetry that Genevieve had given him. On the inside back cover, he had written a short account of their vows and their secret ceremony with ink he had made from berries and rust. He had put his name on it. He had stuck a needle in Genevieve's finger and pressed her bloody thumbprint to the page next to his name. It was a sign, a piece of truth that couldn't be denied. If that book were ever found, it would be a permanent mark on the Finch legacy, a story that couldn't be easily erased. The judge would never have thought to look for the book in the old parish church, where it was hidden behind a loose stone in the back of the fireplace. Kaylin knew he couldn't get the book back on his own. Someone was watching him and paying close attention to everything he did. He needed to send a message to someone, but he didn't trust anyone. The judge's spies were all over the parish, so he came up with a desperate plan that depended on the bravery of a woman who still didn't know anything. He started drawing in the dirt with a stick while he worked in the fields. Maeve thought at first that it was just doodling, but then she saw that the patterns were very detailed, almost like maps. One night, when she brought him a glass of water, he didn't look at her. He just kept drawing, his finger tracing a line from a rough sketch of her cabin to a sketch of the church steeple. He drew a small square inside the church and next to it a shape that looked like a flame. He looked up at her and his eyes begged her to help him. It was a message without words, a map made of dirt. He thought she would understand. Maeve felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. She understood what he wanted. He told her to go to the church and the fireplace. He asked her to get something for him. If you did that, you would go from being a passive observer to an active conspirator in this drama. It was a decision. She could erase the map with her foot, say she didn't understand, and spend the rest of her life quietly serving. She could also trust the strange, quiet man she had bought for 17 cents and walk right into the storm. Maeve couldn't move for 2 days because she couldn't make up her mind. She was afraid of Judge Finch, and it made her sick to her stomach. But Kaylin's eyes haunted her. It didn't look like a criminal. It looked like a man trying to save his own life. She made her choice on the third night. She left her cabin with a small lantern in her hand after Kalen had fallen asleep in the small barn that served as his home. She walked 2 miles to the church, which was the longest 2 miles of her life. Every sound in the trees sounded like Roche, the swamp tracker. The judge's cruel, calculating gaze seemed to be in every shadow. There was no sound or light in the church. The door in the back was never locked. She snuck in, and the air was cool and smelled like old wood and candle wax. She found the fireplace, and her heart raced. In the dim light of the lantern, her rough, calloused fingers searched the stones. She found it, a stone that was a little loose. She pried it open with a broken piece of wood. There was a small, leather-bound book inside the dark hole, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. She took it out, but her hands were shaking so much that she almost dropped it. She didn't want to know, so she didn't open it. She just knew that the secret that was worth more than a man's life was the cause of all this trouble. She put it in her apron, put the stone back, and ran back into the night. The book felt like a block of ice against her skin. She had gone too far. There was no turning back now. Colleen was waiting for her outside the cabin when she got back to the farm just before dawn. He wasn't in the barn. He was standing there watching the road like he was on guard. He saw the book in her hands, and for the first time since they met, a look of something other than despair crossed his face. It was such a huge relief that it was almost painful to see. His fingers touched hers as he took the book from her. "Thank you," he said in a voice full of emotion. "You don't have to thank me," she said, her voice shaking. "Just tell me what to do now." A dog, barking wildly from a nearby farm, broke the silence before dawn. Then another dog barked. Kalen's head shot up, and his body went stiff right away. He said, "He's here," in a flat, cold voice. "Roch!" He gave her the book back. "There is a man," he said quickly and clearly. "His name is Silas. He works the ferry at the Black Creek crossing. He is an old friend, one of the few the judge does not own. Give him this book and tell him the mockingbird is free." Maeve looked at him with a blank expression. "How about you?" "The judge doesn't just want the book," Kalen said, looking past her to the dark tree line. "He wants me. I'll take Roach away from here. I'll give you time. Go now." He turned and ran, not toward the road, but straight into the thick, tangled woods behind the cabin. This was a planned, selfless act. Maeve stood still for a moment, holding the book and hearing his strange message over and over in her head. Then she heard someone moving through the underbrush, and they did it in a way that made her feel uneasy. She ran away. Maeve ran like she had never run before, her lungs tearing as she breathed, and the dark woods closing in on her from all sides. She didn't know the way, so she tripped over roots and got hit in the face by branches that were hanging low. She only knew which way to go to get to Black Creek, and she ran toward it with a fear she had never felt before. She could hear the chase behind her. It wasn't the sounds of a clumsy pursuit. It was the chillingly efficient sounds of a predator, a snapped twig here, a soft footfall there. And Kalen, who was further ahead, made just enough noise to keep the hunter's attention on him, which kept the danger away from her. It was a race to see who could get up first. She finally came out of the woods and onto the muddy banks of Black Creek. The ferry was just a simple wooden raft with a pulley system that moved it. A black man with gray hair and a stooped back stood next to it, getting ready for the first crossing of the day. "Silas," she said, stumbling toward him. The man looked up, and his eyes were sharp and smart. He saw her ripped dress, her scared look, and the book she was holding. "Are you Silas?" she asked again, her voice full of fear. "I'm here," he said in a low, calming voice. "Kalen sent me," she said. breathing hard and holding out the book. "He said to give you this. He said, 'The mockingbird is free.'" Silas's weathered face didn't show any surprise. He took the book with a steady hand and a serious look on his face. He knew how to read the code. It meant that Kalen was starting the last, most desperate part of their plan. It meant that he probably wouldn't make it through the night. He had decided to give up his life to protect the truth. A single sharp cry, a sound of pain that stopped suddenly, echoed through the morning mist from across the creek. Maeve flinched, and her blood ran cold. She knew it was Kalen. Silas's jaw got tight. "Ma'am, get on the ferry," he said in a hurry. He didn't wait for her. He untied the rope and started pulling them across the brown water that was churning. His old muscles were working hard. They saw him when they got to the middle of the creek. Roach the tracker came out of the trees on the other bank. He was holding a long knife that looked dangerous, and the blade was dark. He stood there watching the ferry with a cold, angry look on his face. He was too late. Maeve looked at the man who had just hunted the boy she had bought for 17 cents and probably killed him. She felt so sick and sad that it made her knees buckle. She had been a piece in a game she didn't understand, and people were dying because of it. "What's going to happen now?" she whispered, her voice a broken, raw thing. Silas didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the far bank, as if he was daring the tracker to cross. "Now," he said, his voice full of deep, tired sadness, "the judge loses." He took the book out of his coat and held it up for Roach to see across the water. A sign of defiance and a promise that this story would not end in the swamp's silence. Roach simply turned and melted back into the woods. His mission both a success and a catastrophic failure. They crossed the creek and entered a land that felt like a different country, a place where the judge's power couldn't reach right away. Silas tied up the ferry and took Maeve to a small, hidden cabin that was only a short walk from the bank. An oil lamp lit up a simple room inside. Silas put the book on the table in a way that made her feel strange. He said, "For now, you are safe here." "Who are you?" Maeve finally asked. "Really?" "I knew Kalen's mother," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper, sounding like he was confessing. "Years ago, before the judge bought her, we were from the same place in Virginia. I promised her I would look out for her boy." He paused, his gaze distant. "I failed. I stood by and did nothing for years, too afraid of what the judge could do. Kalen knew I ran this ferry. He knew I had connections to people who help others disappear, the Underground Railroad. He contacted me weeks ago before any of this happened. He had a feeling the judge knew his secret. We made a plan, a desperate one. Getting him out was one thing, but he refused to leave without the proof, without this book." He tapped the cover. "A man's life is short, but the truth can last forever if someone is brave enough to protect it," he said. Finally, he looked at her, and his eyes were full of deep sadness. "He didn't think he would make it. He made me promise that if he sent the signal, I would get the book north no matter what. He gave up his life so that everyone would know what Judge Finch did to his own daughter." Maeve finally gave in. She had been holding back tears for days and weeks. Now they came in a storm of grief for a boy she barely knew, but whose bravery had changed her life. She cried for the love he had lost, the life that had been stolen from him, and the sheer injustice of it all. Silas stayed quiet and let her cry. His silence showed how much he cared about her. She looked at the book on the table when she was done. Her body hurt from all the crying. "His wife," she said, her voice shaky. "What's going on with the judge's daughter?" Silas's face grew hard. "After the judge locked her up, He sent for a doctor from New Orleans who specializes in female hysteria. They said she was mentally unfit and a danger to herself. She was sent to an asylum in Mobile, where people go to be forgotten. She's a prisoner, just like Kaylin was. The judge didn't just take her husband. He took her mind, her freedom, and her name. As far as the world knows, Genevieve Finch had a nervous breakdown and was sent away for her health. The story is neat, clean, and completely false. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a legal and socially acceptable way to kill someone, even though it was a murder of the soul. The judge didn't just get rid of Kaylin. He also got rid of his own daughter, making her a ghost long before she died. Maeve got it now. The 17 cents, the auction, and the tracker were all parts of a carefully planned, evil work of control, and she, the clueless widow, had walked onto the stage and ruined the last act. "What is in the book?" Maeve asked, in a voice that was almost a whisper. Silas opened it slowly. He looked at the inside back cover. The story of their secret marriage was written in Kaylin's beautiful handwriting. There were 2 signatures below the text. One belonged to Kaylin. The other was not a signature but a small brown-red smudge, like a bloody thumbprint. "Genevieve's mark," Silas said in a low voice. "He told me about it. Proof that she entered the vow of her own free will. In the right hands, this book destroys the judge's entire narrative. It proves he manufactured the theft charge. It proves he institutionalized his own daughter to cover up a truth he couldn't stomach." He closed the book. "My contacts will get this to abolitionist publishers in Philadelphia. It will be printed, and the story will be told. It won't bring Kaylin back. It might not even free Genevieve, but it will be a crack in the judge's throne. It will be a fire that he can never completely put out." He looked at Maeve with a serious look on his face. "But you can never go back to Augustine Parish. The judge will always be looking for you. You're the loose end, the witness who knows everything." Maeve thought about her little farm, which was her only home. She remembered the grave of her husband. It was all gone, erased by a history she never wanted to be a part of. She was lost, a refugee from a war that was going on behind closed doors. "Where will I go?" she asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. "North," Silas said. "We'll take you to a safe place, a new life. It's the least we can do. It's what he would have wanted." With the help of Silas and the quiet, determined network of the Underground Railroad, Maeve O'Connell disappeared. She traveled at night, hiding in barns and secret cellars, and kept going north until the Spanish moss of Louisiana was just a bad memory. She changed her name, cut her hair, and became a new person, a woman with no past. The book was a holy and dangerous relic that traveled with her from hand to hand until it finally got to Philadelphia. In the spring of 1850, a pamphlet with no name started to spread. The book was called A Parish of Lies. It was about a powerful Southern judge, his daughter, and the educated slave he killed to protect his family's name. It didn't say Judge Finch or Augustine Parish by name, because that would have been too risky for the printers. But the details were clear enough that the people in charge in Louisiana knew exactly who it was about. The mainstream press called the story abolitionist propaganda, but it was too late to fix the damage. The whispering had begun. The throne had a crack in it. The judge's power, which had once seemed limitless, now had a limit. He started to stay away from people more, and he thought everyone was out to get him. He spent a lot of money looking for the pamphlet's source and the missing widow, but he found nothing. He was up against a ghost. Once the truth was out, it could never be taken back. What about the rest? Not from a bullet in the war that tore his world apart, but from a stroke in 1863. He was alone in his grand library, surrounded by the books that had been the backdrop for his daughter's forbidden love. People say that in his last years he would yell at people he couldn't see, his mind filled with the enemies, real and imagined, who had ruined his perfect legacy. Genevieve Finch lived in the mobile asylum for the rest of her life. She passed away in 1888. Pneumonia was the official cause of death, but the records from the asylum say that she spent the last 40 years of her life in a quiet, detached silence, not talking to anyone. No one knows if she was quiet because of the asylum's cruel treatments or because she wanted to mourn forever. Her father had always wanted her to be a ghost, and she became one. The tracker Roach went back into the swamps. A sheriff's report from 1854 is the last place his name shows up in history. His body was found floating in a bayou, bloated and unrecognizable. The report says that an alligator attack was the cause, but old rumors say that someone caught up with him and paid off a debt from that night on Black Creek. Silas kept running his ferry, helping many people find their way to freedom. He was a quiet, unassuming man, and his act of atonement lasted a lifetime. And Kalin. They never found his body. Rauch probably buried him in a grave that wasn't marked deep in the swamp, where the dark Louisiana soil took him in. The judge wanted him to be erased, and he was. But the story he died to protect lived on. It became a quiet legend, a story told in secret by those who knew the truth. It showed that you can shut someone up, but you can't kill an idea. You can bury a body, but you can't bury the truth forever. People say that the widow Maeve, who lived to be an old woman in a small town in Ohio, never talked about what happened. They say she kept a small, worn-out pamphlet in a locked box until she died. The story of the boy she bought for 17 cents, who was secretly a husband, a rebel, and a king in a world that wouldn't see him. You won't find any official records of any of this if you go to Augustine Parish today. The name Finch is still on the courthouse and the library. The winners write history, which is what it is, but if you go to the Black Creek Crossing, some of the older people might tell you a different story. They'll tell you about a ghost that walks through the woods looking for a book. They'll tell you about a love that was stronger than the law, and a truth that cost them everything. If you've made it this far with me down this dark and hidden path, please leave a comment below that says, "The Mockingbird is free." You're not just watching a story anymore. You're becoming a keeper of it, a witness to a history that was meant to be erased. Isn't it hard to know something that was meant to be forgotten? The 17-cent receipt is now a historical curiosity in a university archive. Most people who see it just think it's a strange, sad deal from a time of violence. They shake their heads at the price and the cruelty, but they don't know the whole story. They don't know what the ink is about. They don't see the ghost of a secret marriage, the cold rage of a powerful judge, or the bravery of a woman who chose to trust a stranger. They don't know that those 17 pennies were the price of a king's ransom in love and rebellion. They see a receipt for a slave, but you see a declaration of war. A war fought in whispers, in hidden books, and in the hearts of those who refuse to be erased. It's a reminder that the most important histories are often the ones that leave the faintest tracks, the ones you have to dig for, the ones you have to fight to keep alive, the ones that powerful men tried to bury under the weight of their laws and their lies. The system that allowed a man like Judge Finch to exist, the one that made his actions perfectly legal, was not just a collection of laws. It was a psychological prison. It was built on the idea that some people were objects, that their lives and loves had no value except what was assigned to them by their owners. Kalin and Genevieve's crime wasn't theft, and it wasn't just love. Their crime was believing they were equals. Their rebellion was the act of seeing the full humanity in each other. That was the one sin the judge and the entire world he represented could not tolerate. because if a slave and a master's daughter could be husband and wife, if they could be bound by a vow that transcended law and property, then the entire foundation of their society was a lie. It would mean that power was just a made-up thing, that social order was a weak fiction, and that the chains were not only on the wrists of the enslaved, but also on the minds of the enslavers. The judge had to destroy them, not just to punish them, but to protect his own sanity, to reinforce the walls of the reality he had built around himself. His cruelty wasn't just an act of revenge, it was an act of desperate self-preservation. He was trying to kill a truth that could have shown him to be a fraud, a king ruling over a kingdom of ghosts. Think about the widow Maeve. In many ways, she is the most important person in this story. She wasn't a hero, she wasn't an abolitionist, she was just an ordinary person faced with an extraordinary choice. She is our representative. What would you do, honestly? What would you do? Would you see the injustice and turn away, afraid of the consequences? Would you tell yourself it wasn't your problem? Most people would. That is the quiet, terrible engine that allows evil to flourish, the apathy of good people. But Maeve, a poor, uneducated widow with nothing to her name, made a choice. She chose to see the man, not the slave. She decided to trust, even though it scared her. She made the choice to act. The judge's laws, money, and anger were nothing compared to her small, brave act of running through the woods with a book she couldn't even read. She didn't just save a book, she saved a truth. She became the unlikely person to tell a story that was never meant to be told. It's a scary reminder that the course of history isn't always decided by kings or generals, but by the small decisions that regular people make when they are in tough situations. The choice to help, the choice to listen, and the choice to run. There has been one last disturbing rumor about Genevieve Finch. The older nurses at the Mobile Asylum used to tell a story about a woman who lived in room 213 and never spoke. They said that every year, on the anniversary of the auction on April 11th, she would do one thing. She would find a piece of charcoal or use her own blood if she had to, and then she would draw one picture on the wall of her cell. There was always the same picture, a mockingbird with its throat cut. Every time, the asylum staff would scrub it off the walls to try to get rid of the strange, sad graffiti, but it would always come back the next year. A yearly, silent tribute to a love that had been silenced and a message to a world that had forgotten her. It was the last thing she did to rebel, a ghost of a memory that wouldn't go away. It seems to say that her father broke her life, but he never really broke her spirit. She still loved Kaylin, and 40 years of institutional abuse couldn't touch that love. It was her own book, written on the walls of her prison. It was a story told in silence and blood, a final testament to the man she had married. The man they had tried and failed to turn into nothing more than a 17-cent ghost. Can you believe that? A love that lasts even after the mind dies. So, why was this story so hard to find? Why would historians and archivists who found parts of it choose to bury it? It doesn't just accuse one person, one judge in a forgotten parish. It accuses the whole system he stood for. It shows that the law is not a way to get justice, but a way to control people. It shows how easy it is for people to do horrible things while still pretending to be civilized by using bureaucracy and the law. This tale is perilous. It implies that the official records, such as deeds of sale and court orders, which we depend on as historical facts, are not always accurate. They are often just the story told by the people in charge. The true history is found in whispers, rumors, anonymous pamphlets, and drawings on the walls of an asylum. What they tried to hide is the real history. It wasn't just mean to sell Kaylin for 17 cents. It was a perversion of the idea of value itself. It was an act of economic and spiritual warfare meant to show that a person's worth could be set and that a soul could be bought and sold. It was the most extreme example of a power that could say a person was worthless and make it legal. But they were wrong. His life was not worthless. It was worth a lot. And the fact that we are here now, more than 100 years later, telling his story and speaking his truth is proof. He died to make us who we are. The point is to make you feel what you're feeling right now: the chill, the unease, and the righteous anger. These kinds of stories aren't meant to make you feel good. They are supposed to wake something up in you. They are supposed to remind you that the world you see is built on stories, and some of those stories are lies that were meant to be told. The history we learn is often like a museum that only shows artifacts that back up the official story. But the real history is like a haunted house, with the ghosts of people who were silenced, erased, and forgotten. The stories are still there, waiting in the walls, the archives, and the soil for someone brave enough to hear them. Calin, Genevieve, and the widow who bought him for 17 cents is more than just a sad story from the past. It's a key. It opens a door in your mind and makes you ask a scary question. What other truths have been hidden? What other spirits are waiting to be heard? The world isn't what it looks like. We live in the aftermath of secrets, and our lives are shaped by battles that were fought and lost in silence long before we were born. This is just one of the stories. There are thousands more. They are waiting for you. The deal that morning in Augustine Parish was meant to be the end of a story. Judge Finch was so full of himself that he thought he could write the last chapter and end a love story that he found offensive. He used the law, the economy, and the fear of his neighbors as his ink. He thought he had made a perfect, silent monument to his own power by erasing everything. But he made a big mistake. He forgot that true stories aren't written down. They are etched on the heart of a person, and the heart has a memory that no law can erase, no ledger can hold, and no amount of time can really erase. He thought he was finishing a book, but all he did was make a ghost that has been haunting the edges of history for 170 years, just waiting for someone to say its name. He wanted to show that a man could only be worth 17 cents. Instead, he showed that one brave act of love could mean everything you know now.